Imagine, you are at a local beer garden, Bulos Brewery, with your colleagues, Alice, Bob, and Charlie. You're colleagues, but you're not that close. You know that one of them is a mathematician, one is a physicist, and one is an engineer, but you can't remember who is which, and their general demeanors aren't helping you figure it out. As the night grows late, you notice that all three of your colleagues are getting quite drunk. Since they won't remember the conversation anyway, now is probably your best chance to figure out who studies in what field. However, since they're so drunk, you can only get the attention of one colleague at a time to ask a question. This means you can't ask a question to multiple colleagues simultaneously. Your colleagues' reduced mental capacities also mean that they're only capable of answering yes-no questions. This may seem simple enough, but there's a catch. You see, you yourself are a computer scientist. At some point during the night, your colleagues decided that it would be fun and quirky to only speak to you in foos and bars. You don't remember how this decision came about, as you are also pretty drunk. The mathematician made some decision on how to map foo and bar to yes and no, but you don't remember what the convention is. Whatever conventions the mathematician chose, you figure that the physicist will commit to the complete opposite convention. For example, if the mathematician decided to use foo as yes, then the physicist would use foo as no. The engineer was oddly quiet during this conversation. It's safe to assume that the engineer wasn't paying much attention to the conversation since it was frivolous musing. Now that everyone is using foo and bar though, the engineer is trying to catch up with the trend. However, since they weren't paying attention, the engineer will randomly choose foo or bar as a response to any of your yes-no questions. The brewery is closing soon, and you only have time to ask 3 questions. What will you ask? I know what you're thinking. Well, I know that what you're thinking falls into one of the following 4 categories. Damn, there's no way this is doable. I think I have a solution. If only there was somewhere I could test it. This is so sloppily phrased. I have so many questions about the setup. I know the sauce. If you're from the first category, I'll get back to you. If you're from the second category, grab a few friends and give your solution a spin. Oh, don't have friends? No problem. You can try your solution with Alice, Bob, and Charlie on GitHub. In fact, you'll probably get more reliable results this way. Please note, however, that Alice, Bob, and Charlie can't be substitutes for real friends. If you're in the third category, you're also in luck. The problem is formulated completely unambiguously on GitHub as well. Just open game.rust and all your questions will be answered. If you're from the last category, stick to the end because I have a challenge for you. Well, it's for everyone else too, but it's especially for you. So, what makes this problem seem so difficult? Well, the short answer is that it took me almost 2 minutes to set it up. Perhaps a more concrete answer is that the system is underdetermined. It's impossible to use only 3 yes-no questions to figure out all of the unknowns. For simplicity, suppose nobody is trying to be quirky, and Alice, Bob, and Charlie just answered your yes-no questions honestly with a yes or a no. How many questions would you need to determine everyone's field of study in this case? Well, if you focus on Alice, you can figure out her field of study with just 2 questions. Then, since there are only 2 remaining possibilities for Bob, you just need to ask him 1 more question. After you figure out Alice and Bob's fields, Charlie must be the remaining field, so you don't even have to ask any questions after that. Overall, you can determine everyone's field of study in 3 questions, but is it possible to do it in fewer than 3 questions? Each yes-no question provides us with at most 1 bit of information. Since there are 6 possible assignments of people to fields of expertise in this system, which is about 2.58 bits, it's impossible to use 2 questions to completely determine the system. Put differently, every yes-no question doubles the number of possible scenarios you can discern, so 2 questions only give you up to 4 discernible scenarios, and you need a 3rd question to bring it past 6. Therefore, 3 questions is optimal. In the original problem, there's a whole new bit of information to consider. Which of foo or bar did the mathematician choose to mean yes? Since this problem now has 12 possible configurations, not even 3 yes-no questions are enough to really determine it. That being said, this extra bit of information is irrelevant to the question. You don't actually care which of foo or bar means yes to the mathematician. You still only care about everyone's respective fields, and this still technically fits in 3 bits. This at least means that we can't rule out the feasibility of this problem. However, this rudimentary analysis doesn't account for the fact that this extra bit obfuscates the information we're actually interested in. But gee, I hear you say, don't the random responses of the engineer also add more bits of irrelevant information to the system? Yeah, but we'll worry about that later. So, how do we nullify the effect of the irrelevant bit of information in our main predicament? This is probably a difficult question to answer in general, and there's no unique approach, but let me provide a relatively simple gadget that we can use to hide the effect of foo and bar. Let's begin by simplifying the problem in a different way. Suppose you're at Boulos Brewery with Alice and Bob only. One of them is a mathematician and the other is a physicist. One of them uses foo to mean yes and bar to mean no, and the other uses the opposite conventions. Your goal is to determine which of them is a mathematician. If the foo bar were closed, then we would clearly only need one question. Just ask Alice if she is the mathematician. The point, though, is even with the foo bar bit, we can still determine which of Alice and Bob is the mathematician with only one question. Wait, G, I hear you say. I want to solve this problem myself first. Of course. In fact, you can even test your solution to this easier variant on the same GitHub link. Okay. To solve this puzzle... Sorry, I needed to yell to make sure people remember to pause. This puzzle is equivalent to a much less obscure and probably much more well-known puzzle. In this scenario, you stand before two identical-looking gates, kept by two identically clad guards. One guard is a knight, who nobly answers every question honestly. The other guard is a knave, who always lies. One gate leads to the castle, and the other leads to the dungeon. By asking a single yes-no question to only one guard, how do you determine which gate leads to the castle? Again, you're going to have to pause if you want to think about this one. While it would certainly make our lives easier if we knew who the knight was, we don't actually need to know this information. In particular, although there are 4 possible scenarios, we're only interested in one bit of information. Obviously, you can't just go up to the guard on the left and ask, "Are you guarding the castle?" If the guard said yes, what does that really tell you? If the guard were a knight, then sure, that would mean the left gate leads to the castle. But if the guard were a knave, then the left gate would lead to the dungeon. In particular, for each response, there is a scenario where the left gate is the castle, and a scenario where the left gate is the dungeon. This means the answer to this question is completely unhelpful. One problem with this question is that the truthful answer to it is only tied to the status of the left gate, and is unrelated to the identity of the guard that you're asking. For example, if you were to instead ask, "Are you the knight and are you guarding the castle?" then the response of no is only possible if the guard you asked is the knight and the knight guards the dungeon. While this doesn't completely solve the problem, by tying our question to both the guard's identity and the destination of the gate, we are able to extract partial information. Maybe one reason we only get partial information is because, since the knave is not a knight, the knave is going to lie and answer yes no matter what gate he guards. You could chalk this imbalance of information up to the fact that the result of a conjunction is unbalanced, mostly being false. This might make you think to use a balanced logical connection instead, such as if and only if. And that would work. You could ask, "Are you a knight if and only if you are guarding the castle?" With this question, the guard will say yes if and only if the gate leads to the castle. However, asking a question like that would immediately have you labeled as a logician, because nobody talks like that. So, to protect your image, let's try to ask that same question in a more ordinary way. So, what is really achieved when you ask, "Are you a knight if and only if P?" If and only if is a logical connective known also to computer scientists as the exclusive NOR. If we think of the first argument as fixed, then exclusive NOR either acts by repeating the second argument if A is true, or by inverting the second argument if A is false. In other words, you can think of the first argument as toggling whether the exclusive NOR acts knightly or knavely. In particular, since the exclusive NOR preemptively negates P before the knave has a chance to lie, this forces the knave to tell the truth about P. Now, the point is that we don't need an auxiliary logical connective to emulate the behavior of the guard. The guard is right there. We can just ask the guard, hypothetically, whether the guard would say yes to our question. This would get the guard to emulate their own behavior and comment on it. If the guard is the knight, then he would just repeat the truth value of P. However, if the guard is the knave, then the guard knows he would lie about the truth value of P, and thus lie about his untruthful response, meaning altogether that he would just tell us the truth of P. In other words, we could just as well get the truth value from either guard about where the castle is by simply asking, "Would you say that you are guarding the castle?" By showering the guard with such modest politeness, even the knave will tell you the truth. This is why Canadians are never faced by such predicaments. Okay, let's go back to the situation where you're with Alice and Bob, who are annoyingly only speaking to you in foos and bars, and you're trying to figure out who is the mathematician. I claim that this is equivalent to the knight and knave problem that we just solved. If you don't think this equivalence is obvious, that's because the equivalence is non-canonical, which is a mathematician's way of saying that it requires making a choice. We may not know which of foo and bar is supposed to mean yes, and Alice and Bob can't agree on it either. So just make up your own damn mind, Neil. Let's just say foo is yes. Once we fix our own notation, the person who uses the same conventions as us is effectively the knight, and the other person is effectively the knave. On the other hand, each person's field of study corresponds to the gate they're guarding, with mathematics obviously being the castle. Under this equivalence, what is the magical question we should ask to determine which of Alice and Bob is the mathematician? Ask Alice, if I asked you if you studied mathematics, would you say foo? Of course, you could also ask her, are you a mathematician if and only if foo is yes, but we've already talked about how this is a faux pas. Okay, let's go through an example. If I run easy mode, I'm going to ask Alice, if I asked you if you study math, would you say foo? She says foo, therefore Alice studies math and Bob studies physics. Now that we have solved the easier variant, we have a new tool for solving the original puzzle with Alice, Bob, and Charlie, where one of them is an engineer who responds to any yes-no question with a random choice of foo or bar. Before you say it, no. Just because Alice and Bob have to account for the mathematician and physicist in the easier version doesn't mean that Charlie has to be the engineer in this situation. Anyone could be the mathematician.
It could be you. It could be me. It could even be...
The real treasure is not the solution to the easier variant, but the skills we've gained along the way. Specifically, we now have a way of circumventing the ambiguity of foo and bar, and we can now eliminate that irrelevant bit of information. Now we're back to 3 bits worth of information to discern. However, there's still a bit of a complication. Although our trick gives us a way of controlling the responses of the mathematician and the physicist to extract the truth, the engineer is nothing but trouble. The fact that the engineer responds randomly means that it's impossible to get information from the engineer directly. Their answers are quite literally meaningless. Since figuring out who is the engineer is one of the objectives of the puzzle, the engineer's responses can still give us some useful information. For example, hypothetically, if I were to ask Alice the same question twice and she responded differently both times, then I know for sure that she is the engineer. That being said, we're not even guaranteed that the engineer will respond differently each time we ask the same question. If we're really unlucky, maybe the engineer will always say the same word. Since we're trying to guarantee that we can determine everyone's field of study in 3 questions, we might as well assume that the engineer is devious and is trying to give answers that will ruin our strategy. This means, effectively, if we ask someone a question, their answer will either be the truth, or utter nonsense if they're the engineer. We should therefore prioritize finding someone who isn't the engineer. We could be normal and just ask her if she's the engineer, but we'll only learn something about her if she says yes. We only have 3 questions, so we can't waste any of them on a maybe. The better strategy is to instead ask her if Bob is the engineer. If she says yes, then she's either telling the truth and Bob is the engineer, or she's the engineer. Either way, Charlie is not the engineer. On the other hand, if Alice says no, then she's either telling the truth and Charlie is the engineer, or she is the engineer. Either way, Bob is not the engineer. Note, of course, that we're not really asking Alice if Bob is the engineer. We're using our logical gadget from the simpler case to try and get this information out of her. Once we know someone who isn't an engineer, we can just ask them who everyone is, and 2 questions later, we win. Let's walk through normal mode. First, we ask Alice, if I asked you if Bob studies engineering, would you say fu? Alice says fu. So either Bob studies engineering, or Alice is the engineer. Either way, Charlie is not the engineer. So now I ask Charlie if she is the mathematician. So I ask Charlie, if I asked you if you study math, would you say fu? Charlie responds fu. Now I need to figure out who the engineer is. So I'll ask Charlie, if I asked you if Alice studies eng, would you say fu? Charlie says bar. Therefore, Alice does not study engineering, so Alice has to be the physicist, Bob is the engineer, and Charlie is the mathematician. If you're still here, thank you for watching. If you liked what you saw, I think YouTube has some conventions for how you can express that, rather than coming up with your own conventions. If you didn't like what you saw, then you must be from that last category and you're sticking around for the end. Now that we're all on the same page, I have a challenge for you. Imagine you are in a completely new scenario, with completely different colleagues, Alice, Bob, Charlie, and Dan. One of them is a mathematician, one's a physicist, one's an engineer, and one's a philosopher, and you don't know who is which. You're a computer scientist, so everyone thought it would be fun and quirky to respond to your yes-no questions in foos, bars, and bazes. If you're wondering why there are 3 responses, you assumed the law of the excluded middle.
Hell no, to the no, 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 hell to the no.
Yeah, it's the philosopher's fault. The mathematician uses classical logic, and has made some decision on how to map yes and no to 2 of the 3 words. In particular, the mathematician never uses one of the 3 words. The physicist, while more interested in quantum field theory, uses the same words as the mathematician. However, the physicist's word for yes is the mathematician's word for no, and vice versa. The engineer, not paying attention, may randomly say any of the 3 words, foo, bar, or baz, to your question. The philosopher, however, wonders, how can one truly know the answer to any yes-no question? As a result, the philosopher only ever responds with the word that the mathematician and the physicist never use. Assuming you may only ask yes-no questions, and that each question may only be directed to one person, how many questions do you need to determine everyone's field of expertise? If you're sitting back and comfortable, excited to hear my solution to this variant, let me tell you a story. Once upon a time, I was an inspired young mathematician studying for his PhD. I had big dreams, like becoming a professor and being able to share my passion for mathematics in the classroom. What I'm trying to tell you is, sometimes dreams don't come true, but I can still give out homework. That's right, this problem is actually your problem. You can play around with it on my GitHub repo and try to come up with a clever solution yourself. Once you do have a clever solution, send it my way. Of course, my days of wasting weekends grading 1,000 engineering assignments are long gone, so there's a better way. When you come up with a strategy, fork your tongue and explain the strategy to your pet snake. If your strategy passes all possible scenarios, submit a pull request and your strategy can be put in the Markdown of Fame. A more detailed explanation of how to do this can be found on GitHub, link in the description below. Despite making this video, I'm awful at logic puzzles. I do have a solution to this puzzle, but the best I can do is solve it in 7 questions, and in doing so, I determine the entire system. This means there is almost certainly a better approach. Can't speak snake? Well, it's kinda like speaking in English, but there's definitely a learning curve if you're new. In this case, don't worry. This video's sponsor, Brilliant, has got you covered. Brilliant has thousands of interactive lessons in AI, data analysis, mathematics, and of course, programming. If you've never tried tricking a rock into giving you segmentation faults, Brilliant's courses on thinking in code, creative coding, and programming with Python are great places to break the ice. You may not get to seg faults right away, unless you write something like this, but you'll get plenty of more informative feedback from Brilliant's highly interactive activities. No matter what your learning goals are, Brilliant can put together a plan to help you get there. To try everything Brilliant has to offer, free for 30 days, visit brilliant.org/gsheaf or click on the link in the description below. By following this link, you'll also get 20% off an annual premium subscription. Thank you so much to Brilliant for sponsoring this video. If you were from the last category, I hope this challenge fills you with determination. If you're still not happy with what you watched, it's fine. I'm not sure whether you're telling the truth, but the knave told me that there are no fans who will always have my back.